Chapter 14. Almost was Lucy's last word on the last night of George's vacation, that vital evening which she had half consented to agree upon for settling things between them. Almost engaged, she meant. And George, discontented with the almost, but contented that she seemed glad to wear a sapphire locket with a tiny photograph of George Amberson Minifer inside it, found himself wonderful in a new world at the final instant of their parting. For after declining to let him kiss her good-bye, as if his desire for such a ceremony were the most preposterous absurdity in the world, she had leaned suddenly close to him and left upon his cheek the veriest feather from a fairy's wing. She wrote him a month later. No, it must keep on being almost. Isn't almost pretty pleasant? You know well enough that I care for you. I did from the first minute I saw you, and I'm pretty sure you knew it. I'm afraid you did. I'm afraid you always knew it. I'm not conventional and cautious about being engaged, as you say I am, dear. I always read over the dears in your letter a time or two, as you say you do in mine, only I read all of your letters a time or two. But it's such a solemn thing it scares me. It means a good deal to a lot of people besides you and me, and that scares me too. You write that I take your feelings for me too lightly, and that I take the whole affair too lightly. Isn't that odd? Because, to myself, I seem to take it as something so much more solemn than you do. I shouldn't be a bit surprised to find myself an old lady some day, still thinking of you, while you'd be away and away with someone else perhaps, and me forgotten ages ago. Lucy Morgan, you'd say, when you saw my obituary. Lucy Morgan. Let me see, I seem to remember the name. Didn't I know some Lucy Morgan or other once upon a time? Then you'd shake your big white head and stroke your long white beard. You'd have such a distinguished long white beard. And you'd say, no, I don't seem to remember any Lucy Morgan. I wonder what made me think I did. And poor me, I'd be deep in the ground, wondering if you'd heard about it and what you were saying. Goodbye for today. Don't work too hard, dear. George immediately seized pen and paper, plaintively but vigorously requesting Lucy not to imagine him with a beard, distinguished or otherwise, even in the extremities of age. Then, after inscribing his protest in the matter of this visioned beard, he concluded his missive in a tone mollified to tenderness, and proceeded to read a letter from his mother which had reached him simultaneously with Lucy's. Isabel wrote from Asheville, where she had just arrived with her husband. I think your father looks better already, darling, though we've been here only a few hours. It may be we've found just the place to build him up. The doctors said they hoped it would prove to be, and if it is, it would be worth the long struggle we had with him to get him to give up and come. Poor dear man, he was so blue, not about his health, but about giving up the worries down at his office and forgetting them for a time, if he only will forget them. It took the pressure of the family and all his best friends to get him to come, but Father and Brother George and Fanny and Eugene Morgan all kept at him so constantly that he just had to give in. I'm afraid that in my anxiety to get him to do what the doctors wanted him to, I wasn't able to back up Brother George as I should in his difficulty with Sidney and Amelia. I'm so sorry. George is more upset than I've ever seen him. They've got what they wanted, and they're sailing before long, I hear, to live in Florence. Father said he couldn't stand the constant persuading. I'm afraid the word he used was nagging. I can't understand people behaving like that. George says they may be Ambersons, but they're vulgar. I'm afraid I almost agree with him. At least I think they were inconsiderate. But I don't see why I'm unburdening myself of all this to you, poor darling. We'll have forgotten all about it long before you come home for the holidays, and it should mean little or nothing to you anyway. Forget that I've been so foolish. Your father is waiting for me to take a walk with him. That's a splendid sign, because he hasn't felt he could walk much at home lately. I mustn't keep him waiting. Be careful to wear your mackintosh and rubbers in raining weather, and as soon as it begins to get colder, your ulster. Wish you could see your father now. Looks so much better. We plan to stay 6 weeks if the place agrees with him. It does really seem to already. He's just called in the door to say he's waiting. Don't smoke too much, darling boy. Devotedly your mother, Isabel. But she did not keep her husband there for the 6 weeks she anticipated. She did not keep him anywhere that long. 3 weeks after writing this letter, she telephoned suddenly to George that they were leaving for home at once. And 4 days later, when he and a friend came whistling into his study from lunch at the club, he found another telegram upon his desk. He read it twice before he comprehended its import. Papa left us at 10 this morning, dearest. Mother. The friend saw the change in his face. Not bad news? George lifted utterly dumbfounded eyes from the yellow paper. My father, he said weakly, she says he's dead. I've got to go home. His Uncle George and the Major met him at the station when he arrived, the first time the Major had ever come to meet his grandson. The old gentleman sat in his closed carriage, which still needed paint, at the entrance to the station, but he got out and advanced to grasp George's hand tremulously when the latter appeared. Poor fellow, he said, and patted him repeatedly upon the shoulder. Poor fellow, poor Georgie. George had not yet come to a full realization of his loss. So far his condition was merely dazed. And as the Major continued to pat him, murmuring "poor fellow" over and over, George was seized by an almost irresistible impulse to tell his grandfather that he was not a poodle. But he said thanks in a low voice and got into the carriage, his two relatives following with deferential sympathy. He noticed that the Major's tremulousness did not disappear as they drove up the street, and that he seemed much feebler than during the summer. Principally, however, George was concerned with his own emotion, or rather with his lack of emotion, and the anxious sympathy of his grandfather and his uncle made him feel hypocritical. He was not grief-stricken, but he felt that he ought to be, and, with a secret shame, concealed his callousness beneath an affectation of solemnity. But when he was taken into the room where lay what was left of Wilbur Minafer, George had no longer to pretend. His grief was sufficient. It needed only the sight of that forever inert semblance of the quiet man who had been always so quiet a part of his son's life, so quiet a part that George had seldom been consciously aware that his father was indeed a part of his life. As the figure lay there, its very quietness was what was most lifelike, and suddenly it struck George hard, and in that unexpected racking grief of his son, Wilbur Minafer became more vividly George's father than he had ever been in life. When George left the room, his arm was about his black-robed mother. His shoulders were still shaken with sobs. He leaned upon his mother. She gently comforted him, and presently he recovered his composure and became self-conscious enough to wonder if he had not been making an unmanly display of himself. I'm all right again, Mother, he said awkwardly. Don't worry about me. You'd better go lie down or something. You look pretty pale. Isabel did look pretty pale, but not ghastly pale, as Fanny did. Fanny's grief was overwhelming. She stayed in her room, and George did not see her until the next day, a few minutes before the funeral, when her haggard face appalled him. But by this time he was quite himself again, and during the short service in the cemetery his thoughts even wandered so far as to permit him a feeling of regret not directly connected with his father. Beyond the open flower-walled grave was a mound where new grass grew, and here lay his great-uncle, old John Minafer, who had died the previous autumn, and beyond this were the graves of George's grandfather and grandmother Minafer, and of his grandfather Minafer's second wife and her 3 sons, George's half-uncles, who had been drowned together in a canoe accident when George was a child. Fanny was the last of the family. Next beyond was the Amberson family lot, where lay the Major's wife and their sons Henry and Milton, uncles whom George dimly remembered. And beside them lay Isabel's older sister, his Aunt Estelle, who had died in her girlhood long before George was born. The Minafer monument was a granite block with the name chiseled upon its one polished side, and the Amberson monument was a white marble shaft taller than any other in that neighborhood. But further on there was a newer section of the cemetery, an addition which had been thrown open to occupancy only a few years before, after dexterous modern treatment by a landscape specialist. There were some large new mausoleums here, and shafts taller than the Ambersons, as well as a number of monuments of some sculptural pretentiousness, and altogether the new section appeared to be a more fashionable and important quarter than that older one which contained the Amberson and Minifer lots. This was what caused George's regret, during the moment or two when his mind strayed from his father and the reading of the service. On the train, going back to college 10 days later, this regret, though it was as much an annoyance as a regret, recurred to his mind, and a feeling developed within him that the new quarter of the cemetery was in bad taste, not architecturally or sculpturally, perhaps, but in presumption. It seemed to flaunt a kind of parvenu ignorance, as if it were actually pleased to be unaware that all the aristocratic and really important families were buried in the old section. The annoyance gave way before a recollection of the sweet mournfulness of his mother's face, as she said good-bye to him at the station, and how lovely she looked in her mourning. He thought of Lucy, whom he had seen only twice, and he could not help feeling that in these quiet interviews he had appeared to her as tinged with heroism. She had shown, rather than said, how brave she thought him in his sorrow. But what came most vividly to George's mind during these retrospections was the despairing face of his Aunt Fanny. Again and again he thought of it. He could not avoid its haunting, and for days after he got back to college the stricken likeness of Fanny would appear before him unexpectedly and without a cause that he could trace in his immediately previous thoughts. Her grief had been so silent, yet it had so amazed him. George felt more and more compassion for this ancient antagonist of his, and he wrote to his mother about her. "I'm afraid poor Aunt Fanny might think now Father's gone we won't want her to live with us any longer, and because I always teased her so much she might think I'd be for turning her out. I don't know where on earth she'd go or what she could live on if we did do something like this, and of course we never would do such a thing, but I'm pretty sure she had something of the kind on her mind. She didn't say anything, but the way she looked is what makes me think so. Honestly, to me she looked just scared sick. You tell her there isn't any danger in the world of my treating her like that. Tell her everything is to go on as it always has. Tell her to cheer up." Chapter 15. Isabel did more for Fanny than telling her to cheer up. Everything that Fanny inherited from her father, old Alec Minifer, had been invested in Wilbur's business, and Wilbur's business, after a period of illness corresponding in dates to the illness of Wilbur's body, had died just before Wilbur did. George Amberson and Fanny were both wiped out to a miracle of precision, as Amberson said. They owned not a penny and owed not a penny, he continued, explaining his phrase. It's like the moment just before drowning. You're not under water and you're not out of it. All you know is that you're not dead yet. He spoke philosophically, having his prospects from his father to fall back upon. But Fanny had neither prospects nor philosophy. However, a legal survey of Wilbur's estate revealed the fact that his life insurance was left clear of the wreck, and Isabel, with the cheerful consent of her son, promptly turned this salvage over to her sister-in-law. Invested, it would yield something better than $900 a year, and thus she was assured of becoming neither a pauper nor a dependent, but proved to be, as Amberson said, adding his efforts to the cheering up of Fanny, an heiress after all, in spite of rolling mills and the devil. She was unable to smile, and he continued his humane gaieties. "See what a wonderfully desirable income $900 is, Fanny? A bachelor, to be in your class, must have exactly $49,100 a year. Then, you see, all you need to do in order to have $50,000 a year is to be a little encouraging when some bachelor in your class begins to show by his haberdashery what he wants you to think about him." She looked at him wanly, murmured a desolate response, she had sewing to do, and left the room, while Amberson shook his head ruefully at his sister. I've often thought that humor was not my forte, he sighed. Lord, she doesn't cheer up much. The collegian did not return to his home for the holidays. Instead, Isabel joined him, and they went south for the 2 weeks. She was proud of her stalwart, good-looking son at the hotel where they stayed, and it was meat and drink to her when she saw how people stared at him in the lobby and on the big verandas. Indeed, her vanity in him was so dominant that she was unaware of their staring at her with more interest and an admiration friendlier than George evoked. Happy to have him to herself for this fortnight, she loved to walk with him, leaning upon his arm, to read to him, to watch the sea with him. Perhaps most of all, she liked to enter the big dining room with him. Yet both of them felt constantly the difference between this Christmas time and other Christmas times of theirs. In all, it was a sorrowful holiday. But when Isabel came east for George's commencement in June, she brought Lucy with her, and things began to seem different, especially when George Amberson arrived with Lucy's father on class day. Eugene had been in New York on business. Amberson easily persuaded him to this outing, and they made a cheerful party of it, with the new graduate, of course, the hero and center of it all. His uncle was a fellow alumnus. Yonder was where I roomed when I was here, he said, pointing out one of the university buildings to Eugene. I don't know whether George would let my admirers place a tablet to mark the spot or not. He owns all these buildings now, you know. Didn't you, when you were here? Like uncle, like nephew. Don't tell George you think he's like me. Just at this time we should be careful of the young gentleman's feelings. Yes, said Eugene. If we weren't, he mightn't let us exist at all. I'm sure I didn't have it so badly at his age, Amberson said reflectively, as they strolled on through the commencement crowd. For one thing, I had brothers and sisters, and my mother didn't just sit at my feet as George's does. And I wasn't an only grandchild either. Father's always spoiled Georgie a lot more than he did any of his own children. Eugene laughed. You need only 3 things to explain all that's good and bad about Georgie. 3? He's Isabel's only child, he's an Amberson, he's a boy. Well, Mr. Bones, of those 3 things, which are the good ones and which are the bad ones? All of 'em, said Eugene. It happened that just then they came in sight of the subject of their discourse. George was walking under the elms with Lucy, swinging a stick and pointing out to her various objects and localities which had attained historical value during the last 4 years. The 2 older men marked his gestures, careless and graceful. They observed his attitude, unconsciously noble, his easy proprietorship of the ground beneath his feet and round about, of the branches overhead, of the old buildings beyond, and of Lucy. I don't know, Eugene said, smiling whimsically. I don't know. When I spoke of his being a human being, I don't know. Perhaps it's more like deity. I wonder if I was like that, Amberson groaned. You don't suppose every Amberson has had to go through it, do you? Don't worry. At least half of it is a combination of youth, good looks, and college. And even the noblest Ambersons get over their nobility and come to be people in time. It takes more than time, though. I should say it did take more than time, his friend agreed, shaking a rueful head. Then they walked over to join the loveliest Amberson, whom neither time nor trouble seemed to have touched. She stood alone, thoughtful under the great trees, chaperoning George and Lucy at a distance. But seeing the 2 friends approaching, she came to meet them. It's charming, isn't it, she said, moving her black-gloved hand to indicate the summery-dressed crowd strolling about them, or clustering in groups, each with its own hero. They seem so eager and so confident, all these boys. It's touching. But of course youth doesn't know it's touching. Amberson coughed. No, it doesn't seem to take itself as pathetic, precisely. Eugene and I were just speaking of something like that. Do you know what I think whenever I see these smooth, triumphal young faces? I always think, oh, how you're going to catch it. George! Oh, yes, he said. Life's most ingenious. It's got a special walloping for every mother's son of 'em. Maybe, said Isabel, troubled, maybe some of the mothers can take the walloping for them. Not one, her brother assured her with emphasis. Not any more than she can take on her own face the lines that are bound to come on her sons. I suppose you know that all these young faces have got to get lines on 'em." "Maybe they won't," she said, smiling wistfully. "Maybe times will change, and nobody will have to wear lines." "Times have changed like that for only one person that I know," Eugene said, and as Isabel looked inquiringly, he laughed, and she saw that she was the only one person. His implication was justified, moreover, and she knew it. She blushed charmingly. "Which is it puts the lines on the faces?" Amberson asked. "Is it age or trouble? Of course, we can't decide that wisdom does it. We must be polite to Isabel." "I'll tell you what puts the lines there," Eugene said. "Age puts some, and trouble puts some, and work puts some, but the deepest are carved by lack of faith. The serenest brow is the one that believes the most." "In what?" Isabel asked gently. "In everything." She looked at him inquiringly, and he laughed as he had a moment before when she looked at him that way. "Oh, yes, you do," he said. She continued to look at him inquiringly a moment or two longer, and there was an unconscious earnestness in her glance, something trustful as well as inquiring, as if she knew that whatever he meant it was all right. Then her eyes drooped thoughtfully, and she seemed to address some inquiries to herself. She looked up suddenly. "Why, I believe," she said in a tone of surprise, "I believe I do." And at that both men laughed. "Isabel," her brother exclaimed, "you're a foolish person. There are times when you look exactly 14 years old." But this reminded her of her real affair in that part of the world. "Good gracious," she said. "Where have the children got to? We must take Lucy pretty soon so that George can go and sit with the class. We must catch up with them." She took her brother's arm, and the three moved on, looking about them in the crowd. "Curious," Amberson remarked, as they did not immediately discover the young people they sought. "Even in such a concourse one would think we couldn't fail to see the proprietor." "Several hundred proprietors today," Eugene suggested. "No, they're only proprietors of the university," said George's uncle. "We're looking for the proprietor of the universe." "There he is!" cried Isabel fondly, not minding this satire at all. "And doesn't he look it!" Her escorts were still laughing at her when they joined the proprietor of the universe and his pretty friend, and though both Amberson and Eugene declined to explain the cause of their mirth, even upon Lucy's urgent request, the portents of the day were amiable, and the five made a happy party. That is to say, four of them made a happy audience for the fifth, and the mood of this fifth was gracious and cheerful. George took no conspicuous part in either the academic or the social celebrations of his class. He seemed to regard both sets of exercises with a tolerant amusement, his own crowd not going in much for either of those sorts of things, as he explained to Lucy. What his crowd had gone in for remained ambiguous, some negligent testimony indicating that, except for an astonishing reliability which they all seemed to have attained in matters relating to musical comedy, they had not gone in for anything. Certainly the question one of them put to Lucy in response to investigations of hers seemed to point that way. "Don't you think," he said, "really, don't you think that being things is rather better than doing things?" He said "rather better" for rather better, and seemed to do it deliberately, with perfect knowledge of what he was doing. Later, Lucy mocked him to George, and George refused to smile. He somewhat inclined to such pronunciations himself. This inclination was one of the things that he had acquired in the 4 years. What else he had acquired it might have puzzled him to state, had anybody asked him and required a direct reply within a reasonable space of time. He had learned how to pass examinations by cramming. That is, in 3 or 4 days and nights he could get into his head enough of a selected fragment of some scientific or philosophical or literary or linguistic subject to reply plausibly to 6 questions out of 10. He could retain the information necessary for such a feat just long enough to give a successful performance. Then it would evaporate utterly from his brain and leave him undisturbed. George, like his crowd, not only preferred being things to doing things, but had contented himself with 4 years of being things as a preparation for going on being things. And when Lucy rather shyly pressed him for his friend's probable definition of the things it seemed so superior and beautiful to be, George raised his eyebrows slightly, meaning that she should have understood without explanation. But he did explain. "Oh, family and all that. Being a gentleman, I suppose." Lucy gave the horizon a long look, but offered no comment.